The smell of purple urine permeated the halls of Windsor Castle. In the royal chambers, animalistic screams echoed off the stone walls as servants rushed in with straitjackets. The man who once commanded the world's largest empire now drooled and shouted obscenities, his glazed eyes fixed on something only he could see. George III, King of England, was having another attack. But this would be just the first of many secrets European royalty would keep under lock and key for centuries. If this kind of story deserves to be remembered, support this project by subscribing to the channel and leaving your comment. Because behind the golden crowns and majestic portraits, there were bodies that slowly rotted, minds that fragmented, and blood that carried invisible curses. In the year 1760, George III ascended the British throne as the promise of a new era. Tall, elegant, and intelligent, the 22-year-old king seemed destined for greatness. His subjects adored him, his advisors respected him, and the empire grew under his leadership. During the first years of his reign, George III proved to be a capable monarch, interested in agriculture, science, and the arts. He married Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz and had 15 children, solidifying the Hanoverian dynasty. But in 1765, something began to change. The king started having strange episodes of mental confusion, accompanied by intense abdominal pain. The baffled royal physicians attributed the symptoms to overwork. No one imagined that, in the veins of the world's most powerful monarch, ran a silent poison, a genetic inheritance that would turn his life into a private hell. Acute intermittent porphyria was a condition virtually unknown in the 18th century. The disease unpredictably attacked the nervous system, causing searing pain, mental confusion, and, in severe cases, psychotic episodes. What most intrigued the doctors was the purplish-red urine George III produced during his crises, a symptom they had never witnessed before. During the attacks, the king transformed into an unrecognizable creature. He would shout profanities he would never use in his normal state, have violent spasms that made his body contort grotesquely, and alternate between moments of crystalline lucidity and profound delirium. The episodes could last for weeks, during which George III was kept in total isolation at Windsor Castle. The court developed an elaborate system of lies to hide the king's condition. When the attacks began, they would announce that His Majesty was suffering from temporary indispositions, or seasonal fevers. Royal physicians were forced to sign non-disclosure agreements under penalty of imprisonment for treason. Any servant who witnessed the crises was immediately transferred to distant rural estates far from prying ears. The timing of George III's attacks could not have been worse. In 1773, during a severe crisis that lasted 2 months, tensions with the American colonies reached a critical point. While the king screamed alone in his chambers, having visions of angels and demons, his ministers were making decisions that would lead to American independence. The American Revolutionary War coincided with one of the most unstable periods of George III's illness, when the attacks became more frequent and violent. The doctors of the era, desperate to cure the king, subjected him to treatments we would now consider torture. They performed constant bloodlettings, believing it would purify his corrupted blood. They forced him to take mercury, arsenic, and other poisons in the hope of expelling the evil humors. During the most violent episodes, they would tie the king to a restraint chair, cover his mouth to muffle his screams, and leave him alone for hours. Queen Charlotte suffered in silence, watching the man she loved slowly disintegrate. She developed a secret protocol for handling the crises. As soon as George III began to show the first signs of instability, he was immediately isolated. His children were forbidden to see him during the attacks, growing up with the image of a father who was at times loving and present, and at others mysteriously disappeared for weeks. The British people began to suspect something was wrong as the king's public appearances became increasingly rare. Rumors circulated in London pubs about the Mad King, but royal censorship ensured that no newspaper dared to publish speculations about George III's mental health. Official propaganda painted a picture of a dedicated monarch who frequently withdrew for study and reflection on the kingdom's welfare. Parallel to George III's mental decline in England, another genetic drama was unfolding in the Spanish court. Charles II, the last Habsburg king of Spain, carried in his deformed body the price of 2 centuries of consanguineous marriages. Born in 1661, Charles was the final product of a dynasty that had systematically practiced incest to maintain the purity of the royal blood. Charles II's lower jaw protruded so grotesquely that he could barely close his mouth. His tongue was too large for his oral cavity, causing him to drool constantly. Chewing was practically impossible. Food had to be turned into gruel and liquid soups for the king to eat. His speech was an incomprehensible mumble, forcing courtiers to lean dangerously close to his deformed face to understand his words. The facial deformity was only the visible part of the problem. Charles II had also inherited a series of internal complications that kept him constantly ill. He suffered from epilepsy, which at the time was seen as demonic possession. During his seizures, his body would contort violently while foam frothed from his deformed mouth. The Spanish court invented increasingly elaborate excuses to explain the king's sudden disappearances. Royal physicians created a special dietary protocol for Charles II. His meals were prepared by specialized cooks who turned fine meats into textureless mashes. Vegetables were boiled until they completely dissolved, and fruits were squeezed into thick juices. Even so, the king often choked or vomited, making every meal a struggle for survival. The Habsburg dynasty had begun its genetic decline in the 16th century when Philip I married Joanna of Castile. From then on, successive generations of marriages between uncles and nieces, first cousins, and even half-siblings created a lethal concentration of defective genes. Charles II was the pinnacle of this deterioration. His coefficient of inbreeding was higher than that of a child of siblings. During the 35-year reign of Charles II, Spain fell into an accelerated decline. The king was incapable of making complex decisions due to his cognitive limitations. His ministers governed in his name while he spent most of his time in his chambers, feeding on gruel and suffering from epileptic seizures. The court developed an elaborate theater to pretend the king was in control, using stand-ins from a distance during public ceremonies. The marriage of Charles II was a cruel farce. At 18, he was forced to marry Marie-Louise d'Orléans, a 17-year-old Frenchwoman. The honeymoon was a disaster. Charles could not consummate the marriage due to his physical deformities and mental limitations. Marie-Louise wrote desperate letters to her family in France, describing the horror of sharing a bed with a man who constantly drooled and had seizures during the night. The pressure to produce an heir consumed the Spanish court. Charles II was subjected to humiliating treatments in an attempt to improve his fertility. Doctors applied irritating ointments to his genitals, forced him to drink potions made from bull testicles, and even performed exorcism rituals, believing his impotence was the result of witchcraft. Marie-Louise died mysteriously at the age of 27, possibly poisoned by the constant pressure and disgust of her marriage. Charles II was then forced to marry again, this time to Maria Anna of Neuburg, a German princess. The second marriage was equally barren, sealing the fate of the Habsburg dynasty in Spain. While Charles II wasted away in Madrid, another genetic secret was being carefully concealed by the British royal family. Prince Leopold, the eighth child of Queen Victoria, carried a condition in his blood that terrified his mother, hemophilia. Born in 1853, Leopold appeared to be a healthy baby in his first few months, but when he began to crawl, minor cuts turned into hemorrhages that lasted for days. A simple scratch on the knee could cause the boy to bleed for a full week, leaving him pale and weak. The royal family quickly realized something was terribly wrong. Hemophilia was a virtually unknown genetic condition at the time, but its effects were devastating. Leopold's blood simply did not clot properly, turning any injury into a potential death sentence. Queen Victoria, who was a carrier of the defective gene, watched in horror as her son bled nonstop after the smallest of accidents. Royal physicians developed extreme protocols to protect Leopold. He was forbidden from running, jumping, or engaging in any physical activity. His toys were carefully selected to eliminate any possibility of injury. The boy grew up in a glass dome, constantly watched by nurses who monitored his every move. At the age of 8, Leopold suffered a seemingly harmless fall while playing in the gardens of Buckingham Palace. What should have been just a bruised elbow turned into a medical emergency. The bleeding was so intense that the boy nearly died. For an entire week, nurses applied constant pressure to the wound while Leopold was delirious with fever and blood loss. From that incident on, the royal family developed an elaborate system of lies to explain the prince's constant hospitalizations. When Leopold had bleeding episodes, the court would announce that he was suffering from fevers or indispositions. Official photographs were carefully staged to hide the purple bruises that covered his body, the result of spontaneous internal hemorrhages. The forced isolation turned Leopold into an introspective and intellectually precocious child. Since he could not play physically, he devoted himself to his studies with obsessive intensity. By the age of 12, he was fluent in 6 languages and showed exceptional talent for mathematics and literature. But his brilliant intelligence was a cruel compensation for a body that constantly betrayed him. Leopold's adolescence was marked by increasingly severe bleeding episodes. Nosebleeds could last for days, confining him to bed with blood-soaked towels. Mouth injuries were especially dangerous, forcing him onto a liquid diet for weeks. The royal family maintained a medical team dedicated exclusively to the prince, ready to intervene at any moment. The darkest secret was that hemophilia did not just affect Leopold. Queen Victoria had passed the defective gene to several of her daughters, who became silent carriers. When these princesses married into other European royal families, they spread the royal curse across the continent. Hemophilia would eventually affect the royal families of Russia, Germany, and Spain, creating a secret network of genetic suffering. Leopold's condition was such a well-guarded state secret that, even within the royal family, few people knew the whole truth. His sisters were kept in the dark about their own carrier status until they began to have hemophiliac sons. Queen Victoria, consumed by guilt for having passed on the disease, became increasingly overprotective and controlling. In Imperial Russia, another genetic secret was being carefully hidden from society. Grand Duchess Alexandra, born in 1847, grew to an impressive height of 6 feet 3 inches, 1.90 meters, a stature considered monstrous for an aristocratic woman at the time. But her extraordinary height was just one symptom of a rare and devastating genetic condition. Alexandra suffered from Marfan syndrome, a connective tissue disorder that affected not only her height but her entire body system. Her arms and legs were disproportionately long, giving her a skeletal appearance that terrified those who saw her. Her joints were hypermobile, causing frequent dislocations and constant pain that left her bedridden for days. The Russian imperial family developed elaborate strategies to hide Alexandra's physical appearance. Her clothes were specially made by dressmakers who swore absolute secrecy. The dresses had long, wide sleeves to disguise her excessively long arms, and voluminous skirts concealed her disproportionate legs. During public events, Alexandra was strategically positioned, so her height would not be apparent. More devastating than her physical appearance was the psychological impact of Marfan syndrome. Alexandra developed a deep depression that consumed her for months on end. She would lock herself in her chambers at the Winter Palace, refusing to see anyone but her closest ladies-in-waiting. During these crises, she would spend weeks without leaving her bed, consumed by a melancholy that seemed endless. The imperial court's doctors did not understand the connection between Alexandra's physical and mental symptoms. They treated her depression as female hysteria and her joint pain as moral weakness. They subjected her to cruel treatments that included ice baths, bloodletting, and massive doses of opium to control her pain crises. Marfan syndrome also affected Alexandra's cardiovascular system in a silent but lethal way. Her heart gradually enlarged, working harder and harder to pump blood through her elongated body. Her arteries dangerously dilated, creating aneurysms that could rupture at any moment. She frequently experienced violent palpitations and chest pains, symptoms the doctors attributed to her nervous nature. To hide her depressive episodes, the imperial family created a narrative that Alexandra was a scholarly and devout young woman who often withdrew for religious contemplation. When she disappeared for months, the court would announce that the Grand Duchess was on a spiritual retreat in remote monasteries. In reality, she remained locked in her chambers, suffering in silence. Alexandra's condition deteriorated rapidly after she turned 20. Her joints became so unstable that she needed assistance to walk. The constant pain prevented her from sleeping, creating a vicious cycle of physical and mental exhaustion. She developed huge bruises all over her body without any apparent trauma, a result of her fragile blood vessels. Alexandra's younger sisters began to show similar symptoms as they grew, confirming the imperial family's worst fears. One of them developed severe scoliosis that grotesquely curved her spine. Another began to have serious vision problems due to the abnormal elongation of her eyeballs. The third sister presented such pronounced arachnodactyly that her hands looked like claws. The Russian imperial family mobilized all available resources to keep the secret. Foreign doctors were secretly brought to St. Petersburg, swearing secrecy even before examining the patients. Official portraits were carefully manipulated by artists who received specific instructions on how to depict the Grand Duchesses to mask their deformities. The end came swiftly for Alexandra. At age 35, during a seemingly normal dinner, she simply collapsed. Her heart, weakened and enlarged by Marfan syndrome, could no longer sustain blood circulation. She died instantly, before any doctor could intervene. The official cause of death was recorded as sudden cardiac arrest, with no mention of her genetic condition. While the European aristocracy struggled to hide its genetic degenerations, a new tragedy was unfolding in the German court. Prince Friedrich, heir to a powerful Prussian dynasty, began showing alarming signs of premature aging at the age of 12. His hair, which should have been the golden glory of aristocratic youth, began to fall out in clumps, leaving an irregular baldness that no hat could completely conceal. Progeria, a condition that causes children to age up to 10 times faster than normal, turned Friedrich into a living anomaly. By 14, his skin had developed deep wrinkles and age spots. His arteries hardened prematurely, causing chest pains that made him moan through the nights. The boy who should have been playing with lead soldiers now walked hunched over like an old man, leaning on specially made canes. The German court panicked upon realizing their future king was disintegrating before their eyes. Friedrich lost all his teeth by 15, forcing him onto a diet of gruel and soups served in private chambers, away from prying eyes. His voice, which should have been naturally changing in adolescence, became a weak, trembling whisper, as if it belonged to an 80-year-old man. Friedrich's bones became as fragile as crystal. A simple fall could result in multiple fractures that took months to heal improperly. He was forbidden from any physical activity and lived virtually confined to a padded wheelchair, surrounded by nurses who monitored every movement to prevent accidents. To keep the secret, the royal family created an elaborate narrative about studies abroad. Whenever Friedrich was supposed to appear in public, they would announce that the prince was at prestigious universities in France or England, perfecting his education. In reality, he never left his chambers in the castle, where he slowly wasted away, hidden from the world's eyes. Friedrich's suffering was indescribable. At 16, when he should have been discovering the pleasures of youth, he looked like a 40-year-old man ravaged by decades of illness. His hands developed severe arthritis that prevented him from writing or holding objects. His eyesight deteriorated rapidly, forcing him to wear glasses with extremely thick lenses that distorted his already sunken eyes. Friedrich's cardiovascular condition worsened daily. His young heart worked like that of an elderly man, pumping blood through hardened and calcified arteries. He suffered minor heart attacks regularly, episodes that left him prostrate and breathless for hours. The doctors knew it was only a matter of time before a more severe attack ended his life prematurely. The royal family maintained a corps of physicians dedicated exclusively to Friedrich, all required to sign non-disclosure agreements that prevented them from discussing the case, even with colleagues. These professionals tried desperate experimental treatments, including blood transfusions from healthy youths in the hope of slowing the aging process. Nothing worked. Progeria ran its relentless course. Friedrich died 3 days before his 19th birthday, weighing only 77 pounds. His body had become a shrunken, decrepit version of a very old man. The funeral was held in a private ceremony with only immediate family members present. The casket remained sealed so that no one could see what was left of the young prince who was supposed to inherit the throne. The secret autopsy revealed organs completely ravaged by progeria. Friedrich's heart was so damaged that the doctors wondered how he had managed to live so long. His arteries were clogged with fatty plaques typical of elderly men, and his bones had the density of paper. The medical report was immediately sealed in the royal archives, classified as a state secret for an indefinite period. These genetic secrets, carefully guarded for centuries, were just the tip of the iceberg of a terrible reality. The European aristocracy had become a living laboratory of genetic degeneration. The consequences of decades of consanguineous marriages and the pressure to maintain blood purity were creating generations of defective heirs, condemned to lives of silent suffering. The approaching end was heralded by increasingly obvious signs: seizures that could no longer be hidden, deformities that no clothing could disguise, and premature deaths that threatened to extinguish entire dynasties. The weight of genetic inheritance was about to exact its final price, and not all the power and wealth in the world could stop the coming reckoning. The year 1788 marked the final collapse of George III's sanity. During a session in Parliament, the king began to speak non-stop for hours, jumping from topic to topic in a torrent of disconnected words. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembled violently, and he gestured so frantically that the parliamentarians recoiled in fear. When he was finally removed from the chamber, George III screamed that he could see angels flying around the ceiling, pointing at creatures that existed only in his fragmented mind. The crisis of 1788 lasted 4 full months. George III was kept in a straitjacket for weeks on end, tied to a special chair that prevented him from harming himself. He assaulted nurses, spat out food, and alternated between episodes of homicidal rage and convulsive weeping. At night, his screams echoed through Windsor, causing servants to cover their ears and mutter prayers. Queen Charlotte would have panic attacks whenever she heard her husband's howls, locking herself in her chambers with the younger children. The desperate royal physicians subjected the king to tortures they called treatments. They applied leeches all over his body until he was as pale as paper. They forced him to ingest antimony, a toxic metal that caused violent vomiting, believing it would expel the madness from his system. During his lucid moments, George III begged them to stop the treatments, but his pleas were ignored by the very doctors who had sworn to protect him. The lowest point came when the doctors decided to apply thermal shock treatment. They plunged the king, still conscious, into tubs of boiling water, immediately followed by immersion in ice-cold water. The thermal shock caused such violent convulsions that George III bit through his own tongue. He spent 3 days delirious with a high fever, babbling words in non-existent languages. The regency of his son, the future George IV, was established in absolute secrecy. Officially, the king was temporarily indisposed, but behind the scenes, power had been completely transferred. George III spent the last years of his life as a ghost in Windsor, alternating between moments of painful lucidity and plunges into ever deeper mental abysses. When he died in 1820, at the age of 81, his body was ravaged by decades of brutal treatments, and his mind had completely disintegrated. The autopsy revealed a visibly damaged brain, with entire areas necrotized by porphyria. But the most shocking discovery was in the medical records. George III had passed the disease to several of his 15 children, creating a British royal line tainted for generations. Porphyria would continue to haunt the royal family for over a century, manifesting in sporadic episodes that were systematically hidden from the public. In Spain, the end of Charles II was even more grotesque. In 1700, at the age of 38, the Habsburg king was literally rotting alive. His deformed jaw had developed purulent ulcers that exuded a nauseating odor. He could no longer swallow even liquids and was forced to live on drops of sugared water dripped directly into his throat. His body had become a skeleton covered in skin, weighing a mere 99 pounds. The last months of Charles II were a spectacle of medical horror. His legs developed open sores that never healed, constantly leaking pus. Gangrene began to spread through his toes, requiring amputations that were performed without anesthesia while the king screamed in pain. His scalp, bald and covered in sores, bled continuously, staining the royal pillows with clotted blood. The Spanish court maintained the royal farce to the end. Even when Charles II was clearly dying, they organized ceremonies where a stand-in represented the king from a distance, while the real monarch agonized in his chambers. During the final public appearance, the king, who waved to the crowd, was actually an actor wearing masks and voluminous robes, while Charles II lay in a coma in the castle. The final moment came in October 1700. Charles II spent 5 days in agony, vomiting black blood and having seizures that made his body contort inhumanly. His last moments were witnessed by only 3 people: his confessor, a doctor, and his second wife, who refused to leave the room despite the unbearable stench of decomposition that had already begun. The autopsy of Charles II shocked even the experienced doctors of the time. His heart was the size of a peppercorn, his lungs were corroded, his liver was as hard as stone, and his intestines were completely necrotic. The doctors wrote that it was a miracle he had survived so long with such deteriorated organs. Most importantly, Charles II died without heirs, officially extinguishing the Habsburg dynasty in Spain and ending 2 centuries of systematized genetic degeneration. Prince Leopold of England met his fate at the age of 30 in an equally brutal manner. In March 1884, during a stay in Cannes, France, he slipped on a rug and lightly hit his head on the marble floor. For any normal person, it would have been a minor accident. For Leopold, it was a death sentence. The cerebral hemorrhage began immediately after the fall. Leopold felt a splitting headache and, within minutes, began vomiting blood. His eyes became bloodshot as the intracranial pressure rose dangerously. The local doctors, unfamiliar with hemophilia, tried conventional treatments that only worsened the situation. For 12 hours, Leopold remained conscious as his brain bled internally. He whispered disjointed words to his wife, apologizing for leaving her a widow so young. His last words were a cruel irony. "Finally, I feel no more pain," referring to the decades of suffering hemophilia had caused him. He died in agony, drowning in his own blood. The news of Leopold's death was carefully manipulated by the British royal family. Officially, he had died of complications arising from epilepsy, with no mention of hemophilia or the cerebral hemorrhage. His body was quickly embalmed to hide the signs of internal bleeding, and the funeral was held with a closed casket to maintain the medical secret. Leopold's most sinister legacy was discovered only years after his death. 2 of his daughters had inherited the hemophilia gene from their maternal line, spreading the disease to other European royal families. Hemophilia eventually affected the Russian imperial family through Tsarina Alexandra, indirectly leading to the fall of the Romanovs when the hemophiliac Tsarevich Alexei became dependent on the mystic Rasputin. In Russia, Alexandra died suddenly during an official dinner in 1882. She was conversing normally with guests when her face contorted in an expression of extreme pain. She clutched her chest, murmured, "I can't breathe," and collapsed onto the table, knocking over crystal glasses that shattered on the marble floor. Her death was instantaneous. The heart, hypertrophied by Marfan syndrome, simply stopped. What shocked the witnesses most was the rigor mortis that set in almost immediately. Alexandra's abnormally long body stiffened into a grotesque position, with her arms and legs extended at unnatural angles. The undertakers struggled to place her in the coffin due to the disproportionate size of her limbs. During the wake, the imperial family took extreme care to hide Alexandra's deformities. They used a specially built, longer-than-standard coffin, and strategically placed flowers to mask her elongated hands. Even in death, she had to maintain the appearance of aristocratic normality. Alexandra's sisters met equally tragic fates. The first died at 28, when her spine, severely curved by scoliosis, punctured a lung. The second lost her sight completely at 25, and spent her last 10 years of life in total darkness, dying of a systemic infection after a fall she could not foresee. The third sister lived to 32, but her deformed hands prevented her from performing any basic activities, forcing her to live as a total invalid. Prince Friedrich of Germany faced his final moments as a spectacle of human decay. 3 days before his 19th birthday, on a seemingly normal morning, he tried to get out of bed and simply collapsed. His youthful heart, aged by progeria to the state of an 80-year-old's organ, went into final cardiac arrest. Friedrich's final moments were witnessed only by his mother and a private physician. His tiny body convulsed violently for 2 minutes before falling still forever. The doctor later commented in his private records that he had never seen a corpse so ravaged by age in such a young body. Friedrich's funeral was an exercise in appearance engineering. The body was wrapped in special fabrics to give the impression of a more normal build. Heavy makeup tried to disguise the deep wrinkles and age spots. Even so, the casket remained closed throughout the ceremony, officially due to the sudden nature of the death, but in reality to hide what progeria had done to the young prince. The secret autopsy revealed complete devastation. Friedrich's organs were so deteriorated that they seemed to belong to a very old man. His arteries were completely blocked, his bones were as fragile as paper, and his brain showed signs of extreme aging. The medical report was classified as top secret and remained sealed for over a century. These genetic secrets did not die with their bearers. On the contrary, they spread through dynastic marriages, creating an interconnected web of European royal families contaminated with defective genes. Hemophilia traveled from England to Russia. Porphyria resurfaced sporadically in the descendants of George III. The Habsburg deformities reappeared in seemingly unrelated lineages. Most disturbingly, these conditions were systematically hidden for centuries, creating completely falsified historical records. Official portraits were manipulated, death certificates were altered, and witnesses were silenced or eliminated. The official history of European royalty is, in large part, a carefully constructed lie to hide decades of genetic suffering. The human cost of this dissimulation was devastating. Dozens of children were born condemned to lives of pain because of suppressed genetic information. Marriages were arranged without knowledge of hereditary incompatibilities. Entire dynasties collapsed because of medical secrets that could have been avoided with transparency. But perhaps the most sinister aspect of this story is its contemporary relevance. The power structures that allowed these medical cover-ups have not disappeared. They have simply evolved. Today, corporations hide information about dangerous products, governments classify public health data, and elites continue to manipulate information to maintain their privileged positions. The difference is that in the 18th century, the secrets died with their bearers. In the digital age, the consequences of suppressed information can be global and permanent. The lessons from European royalty show us that when power combines with medical secrets, the inevitable result is unnecessary and systematic human suffering. Genetics do not recognize noble titles or family wealth. The defective genes of the Habsburgs were just as lethal as they would be in any peasant family. Leopold's hemophilia bled the same way it would in any poor child. George III's madness was just as devastating regardless of his crown. What modern technology offers us is the possibility of breaking these cycles of suffering through transparency and scientific knowledge. But this requires us to learn from the historical mistakes of royalty that medical secrets are ultimately more dangerous than the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. The European royal families paid the ultimate price for 2 centuries of consanguineous marriages and an obsession with blood purity. Their bodies became battlefields where defective genes fought until entire dynasties were extinguished. They discovered too late that some traditions are curses in disguise, and that pure blood can be the most tainted of all. If this story moved you, share it. The more people know about the dangers of hiding critical medical information, the less likely it is that these horrors will be repeated in new forms. Because in the end, health transparency is not just a medical issue, it's a matter of human survival.